Welcome to a list of places on Google Earth so strange that if someone described them to you, you'd assume they were made up. And I'm not talking about blurry glitches or fake internet screenshots. Every place here is unusual for a very specific reason. And as the list goes on, each location becomes more and more bizarre, mysterious, or visually unbelievable. The final place on this list is a gigantic structure in the Sahara, so massive and perfectly circular that some people believe it matches what ancient writers described as Atlantis. Number 2 looks impossible from above, a white desert scattered with thousands of blue lakes. Number 6 is a massive geometric pattern in the Chinese desert that sparked years of conspiracy theories about secret military testing and satellite calibration. And number 8 is a giant volcanic monolith in the United States, so unnatural looking that some people genuinely believe it's the petrified stump of a colossal ancient tree. But let's start with number 1. Our first stop takes us to the plains of Western Canada. At first glance, there's nothing here that should belong on a list like this, but when viewed from exactly the right height and from exactly the right angle, this landscape suddenly turns into something so bizarre that it became one of the most famous accidental discoveries ever made on Google Earth. This first location is one of the best examples of how Google Earth can completely change the way we see a landscape. Because hidden in the Badlands of southern Alberta, Canada, is what looks like the profile of a giant human face staring up at the sky. It has a forehead, an eye, a nose, lips, and even what looks like a neck. At first glance, it looks exactly like some kind of massive earthwork or prehistoric geoglyph. But unlike some of the human-made sites later on this list, this one was never carved by anyone. This formation is known as the Badlands Guardian, and what makes it so strange is that the face only really works from the air. From the ground, there's no giant monument here. But from above, the dry gullies and eroded ridges in the soft sediments line up so perfectly that your brain instantly turns them into a human profile. This is a textbook case of pareidolia, the same effect that makes people see faces in clouds or random shadows. The geology behind it is actually simple. Southern Alberta is full of badlands terrain, where soft sediments were carved apart by runoff and erosion after the last ice sheets retreated. Over time, those natural processes created one accidental arrangement that just happens to look uncannily human from above. There's also one detail that made the image even more famous. Near what looks like the ear, the Guardian appears to be wearing headphones. But that part is actually a modern dirt road and an oil well site that just happened to line up with the older erosional pattern. It was first spotted in 2006 by Lynn Hickox while exploring Google Earth. And that discovery story is almost as interesting as the formation itself, because it perfectly captures what made Google Earth so addictive when it first launched. Suddenly, ordinary people could scan remote landscapes all over the planet and stumble onto things that looked impossible. Some of them turned out to be real mysteries. Others, like this one, turned out to be perfect examples of how easily the human brain can turn random geology into something that feels intentional. From the Badlands of Canada, we go to the northeastern coast of Brazil. The second place on this list looks like one of the driest places on Earth. Endless white dunes stretching to the horizon. But from above, this landscape reveals something that should not exist here at all. This second location looks so strange from above that if you saw it without context, you'd probably assume the image was fake, because from space, Lençóis Maranhenses looks like a giant white desert, scattered with thousands of bright blue lakes. It almost looks like someone took a normal dune field and photoshopped water into every low point, but this place is completely real, and even stranger than it first appears. Lençóis Maranhenses is a massive coastal landscape in northeastern Brazil, made up of enormous white sand dunes stretching across an area of roughly 156,000 hectares. And the first thing that makes it so unusual is that, despite how it looks, this is not actually a desert. That's what makes it such a perfect Google Earth location. Every year, after the rainy season, water gets trapped between the dunes, creating thousands of temporary freshwater lagoons that can range from bright turquoise to deep blue-green. For a few months, the entire landscape turns into something that looks less like Earth and more like an alien planet. The dunes themselves are formed by sand carried inland from the coast by wind, while the lagoons appear because rainwater collects above less permeable sediment layers in a raised groundwater table. In other words, the reason this place looks so impossible is because it combines two things your brain does not expect to see together: a giant dune field and a huge amount of fresh water. And that contradiction is exactly why this place became famous online. For years, people kept calling it the only desert with lakes, even though that description is technically wrong. It only looks like a desert. Climatically, it isn't one. In 2024, UNESCO officially recognized the park for its exceptional natural beauty and unusual geomorphology, which basically means the same thing people on the internet had already figured out years earlier. From above, this place looks absurd. From the coast of Brazil, we go to the deserts of southern Peru. The third place on this list is one of the most famous things ever found from above. But even after decades of research, it still looks so strange that people continue to invent theories about why it was made at all. Scattered across the dry desert plains of southern Peru, the Nazca Lines are a huge network of giant geoglyphs, straight lines, trapezoids, and enormous animal figures carved directly into the ground. There are hummingbirds, monkeys, spiders, birds, and long geometric shapes stretching across the landscape, all created by removing the darker surface stones and exposing the lighter ground underneath. And what makes them so strange is the scale. Some of these figures are so large that, from the ground, you can barely understand what you're looking at. But from the air, the entire desert suddenly turns into what looks like a giant coded message. The Nazca Lines were created between roughly 500 BC and 500 AD by the Nazca culture, and for decades, they've been one of the biggest generators of wild theories on Earth. Ancient astronauts, alien landing strips, giant star maps, messages to the gods. Almost every possible explanation has been thrown at them, but the real story is actually more interesting than most of the conspiracy theories. In 2024, researchers from Yamagata University and IBM used AI and drone imagery to identify 303 previously unknown geoglyphs, nearly doubling the number of known figurative designs. And what that research suggested is that not all of these geoglyphs serve the same purpose. Some of the smaller relief-style figures seem to have been placed close to pathways, where they may have been seen by smaller groups moving through the landscape. The larger line-based designs, meanwhile, were likely tied to broader communal rituals and movement across the desert itself. So instead of one giant mystery with one giant answer, the Nazca Lines may actually be a whole system of different symbols used in different ways. That doesn't make them any less strange. If anything, it makes them even stranger. Because even now, with AI, drones, and modern archaeology, we're still discovering new giant images hidden in one of the most famous deserts on Earth. From the deserts of Peru, we go to the swamps of Argentina. The fourth place on this list doesn't look ancient, and it doesn't look enormous. But from above, it looks so unnaturally perfect that people have spent years trying to explain how it could even exist. Hidden in the wetlands of Argentina's Paraná Delta is a nearly perfect circle, floating inside another nearly perfect circle. From above, it looks exactly like a giant eye, which is where it gets its name, El Ojo, or the eye. And unlike some of the larger locations on this list, this one is not famous because of its size. It's famous because of how unnervingly precise it looks. The floating island itself is roughly 120 meters, or about 390 feet across, and it sits inside a circular pool of water that is almost just as cleanly shaped. If you saw it in a movie, you'd probably assume it was CGI. But satellite imagery shows it has been there for years, with the shape already visible in imagery from the early 2000s. It became widely known in 2016 after Argentine filmmaker Sergio Neuspiller noticed it while searching the delta for unusual locations. And once images of it started spreading online, the theories came fast: UFO base, secret laboratory, hidden Nazi structure, even stories about some kind of supernatural energy source buried under the swamp. But the likely explanation is much simpler, and honestly, much more satisfying. The most accepted idea is that Eloho is a floating mat of vegetation, roots, reeds, and organic material, slowly rotating in place because of water circulation in the surrounding marsh. As it turns, the edges of both the island and the pond gradually grind against each other, which helps maintain that almost absurdly circular shape. In other words, the reason this place looks artificial is because nature accidentally created a system that keeps correcting itself. It's just a swamp, a floating island, and a shape so suspiciously perfect that the internet immediately decided there had to be something more going on. From the swamps of Argentina, we go to the middle of the Karakum Desert. The fifth place on this list looks like something straight out of a disaster movie, because in the middle of this empty landscape, there is a giant crater that has been burning for decades, and no one can say exactly when it will stop. The fifth place on this list is one of the few where the satellite view almost doesn't do it justice, because in the middle of the Karakum Desert in Turkmenistan is a giant crater that has been on fire for decades. It's known as the Darvaza Gas Crater, though most people know it by the far more dramatic name, the Gates of Hell. From above, it looks like a glowing wound in the earth, a nearly perfect circular hole in the desert, roughly 70 meters, or about 230 feet across, and around 30 meters, or about 100 feet deep. During the day, it already looks unnatural, but at night, it becomes one of the most surreal places visible from above anywhere on the planet. And the craziest part is that this is probably not some ancient volcanic feature or natural eternal flame. It was most likely caused by a drilling accident. The commonly accepted story is that Soviet engineers were exploring for natural gas here when the ground collapsed beneath a drilling rig, opening up a crater connected to a gas pocket below. To stop dangerous methane from spreading, the gas was reportedly set on fire, with the assumption that it would burn out in a matter of days. Instead, it kept burning, for decades. There is one important catch, though. The exact details are surprisingly hard to verify, because the original Soviet documentation is either unclear or simply never became widely available. So the broad story is widely accepted, but some of the specifics are still a little murky. That uncertainty only made the place more famous, because once people started seeing it online, Darvaza immediately became one of those locations that felt too dramatic to be real. A giant fire pit in the middle of nowhere, in one of the most secretive countries on Earth, with a name like the Gates of Hell. And even now, it's still changing. In 2025, Turkmenistan reported that the fire had weakened significantly after new wells were drilled nearby to reduce gas pressure, with emissions and visible burning said to be cut by more than 3 times. So for the first time in decades, one of the strangest places on Google Earth may actually be starting to fade. From a crater that has burned for decades, we go deeper into Asia. The 6th place on this list looks completely different, but it triggered just as many theories. Because in the middle of a remote desert, someone created giant geometric patterns so strange that people started wondering if they were messages, targets, or something even more secretive. The 6th place on this list is one of the best examples of how Google Earth can make modern infrastructure look like a full-blown conspiracy. Scattered across the deserts of northwestern China are a series of enormous geometric patterns so large they only really make sense from above. Long white zigzags stretching across the ground, huge grid-like markings, and in some places, circular or radial targets that look almost like something designed to be seen from space. When these first started getting attention online, people immediately went wild with theories. Secret military targets, hidden missile test zones, messages for satellites, even claims that China was building giant coded symbols in the desert for reasons no one could explain. And honestly, from above, it's easy to see why. Because these aren't random markings. Some of them are massive. But unlike the older mysteries on this list, the real explanation here is actually modern, technical, and in its own way, just as interesting. The strongest explanation is that many of these patterns were built as satellite calibration targets. In other words, giant high-contrast markings used to test and calibrate imaging systems from above. Some of the circular and radial layouts also appear to be linked to radar testing and remote sensing, which would explain why they look so oddly precise, and why they're placed in remote desert terrain where there's very little visual interference. So, the most likely explanation is satellite calibration and testing. But when something this huge and this strange is sitting in the middle of a remote desert, it's very hard not to feel like you're looking at something you were never meant to see. From the deserts of western China, we go to the empty steppes of Central Asia. The 7th place on this list is much smaller, but somehow even more suspicious, because from above, it looks exactly like the last thing you'd ever expect to find carved into the ground. The 7th place on this list is the kind of image that was guaranteed to go viral the moment people found it on Google Earth. Because in northern Kazakhstan, near the edge of a lake, there is a giant pentagram carved into the ground. A nearly perfect 5-pointed star inside a circle, so clear from above that once people noticed it, the internet immediately went insane. For years, it was reposted with the same theories: satanic symbol, secret cult site, occult ritual ground, hidden temple, and from above, it really does look suspicious. The full shape is roughly 366 meters, or about 1,200 feet across, which makes it large enough to be instantly recognizable even from high altitude. It's not some vague outline you have to squint at. It's a giant pentagram, sitting in the landscape almost as if someone wanted it to be found from orbit. But the real explanation is much less supernatural, and honestly, much more interesting in a Google Earth kind of way. According to archaeologist Emma Uzmanova, the shape is most likely the remains of a Soviet-era park, or planned public space, laid out in the form of a star. And that actually makes perfect sense, because the 5-pointed star was one of the most common symbols of the Soviet Union. What looks sinister today would have looked completely ordinary in that political and cultural context. In other words, what made this place look like an occult mystery was really just a forgotten symbol from a vanished system. From the empty steppes of Kazakhstan, we go back to the United States. The 8th place on this list doesn't look like it belongs in the surrounding landscape at all, because rising out of the plains below is a giant rock formation so unnatural looking that some people genuinely believe it shouldn't even be possible. Rising out of the plains of northeastern Wyoming, Devil's Tower is a giant rock monolith that seems to appear almost out of nowhere. It rises roughly 386 meters, or about 1,267 feet above the surrounding landscape, with steep vertical sides and a flat top that makes it look less like a normal mountain, and more like something that was placed there. And what really makes it stand out are the sides. The entire formation is covered in long, nearly vertical cracks and columns, which from a distance can make it look artificial, almost like some kind of colossal carved structure. Or, if you've spent too much time online, a giant petrified tree stump. But to be honest, you never know. That theory has actually become one of the most famous fringe explanations tied to this place, because if you just look at the shape, it does kind of resemble the stump of an absurdly massive ancient tree. But the real explanation is much more grounded and, honestly, just as impressive. Devil's Tower is made of igneous rock, and the most widely accepted explanation is that it formed when magma pushed upward underground and then cooled, creating the famous vertical columns as the rock contracted. Over immense periods of time, the softer rock around it eroded away, leaving the tower exposed. There is still some debate over the exact type of intrusion it once was. Geologists broadly agree on the magma part, but not every detail of the original structure. And that uncertainty only adds to the feeling that this thing doesn't quite belong here. It's also far more than just a strange rock. Long before it became famous online or in movies, it was already a sacred place for many Native American tribes, often known as Bear Lodge. It later became the first national monument in U.S. history in 1906, and then entered pop culture forever after appearing in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which means this isn't just one of the strangest places on Google Earth. It's one of the few that was already legendary, long before satellites ever existed. From the plains of Wyoming, we go to the middle of the Sahara. The final place on this list is so massive that you can't even understand what you're looking at until you zoom far out. And once you do, what appears in the desert is so strange, so perfectly circular, and so unnaturally precise that for years people have tried to convince themselves it has to be something more than geology. In the middle of the Sahara Desert in Mauritania is the Richat Structure, better known as the Eye of the Sahara. And unlike most places on this list, this is not something you slowly discover as you zoom in. It's the opposite. You only understand how strange it is when you zoom far out. Because what appears in the desert is a gigantic circular formation roughly 40 kilometers, or about 25 miles across, made up of concentric rings so clean and so symmetrical that from orbit it looks almost designed, like a giant target, or the ruins of some impossible lost city. And that exact feeling is why this place has become one of the most famous, maybe it's not natural locations on Earth. For years, people have claimed the Richat Structure matches ancient descriptions of Atlantis, especially the circular city described by Plato. And to be fair, if you were trying to invent a real-world candidate, this is exactly the kind of place you'd pick. Massive circular rings, isolated in a remote landscape, and strange enough that even astronauts were stunned by it. In fact, the formation became globally famous after astronauts photographed it during the Gemini 4 mission in the 1960s. But despite how artificial it looks, the scientific explanation is much less dramatic. The Richat Structure is now understood to be a deeply eroded geological dome, shaped over immense periods of time by uplift, intrusive rock activity, and differential erosion. In simple terms, different rock layers wore away at different rates, leaving behind the giant circular ridges that make it look so impossible from above. One of the strangest places you can find on Google Earth isn't a ruin, a weapon, or a hidden message. In my opinion, it's just geology, on a scale so absurd that the human brain still wants it to be something more. But as always, you never truly know. So, after witnessing all of those places, one question remains. Which one of them was the most interesting? Or did I miss any strange places you'd like to see in the next videos? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and check out these videos next. Thanks for watching. Bye.